My family actually laughed out loud when I walked into the grand ballroom alone. My younger sister pointed her manicured finger at me from across the room and whispered loud enough for the entire party to hear that it was a tragedy I could never find a man willing to tolerate my boring personality. A few relatives chuckled into their expensive champagne glasses. My brother-in-law smirked, like he owned the place, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. But what none of them knew was that I already held the deed to the multi-million-dollar property we were standing in. And they certainly did not know that the powerful billionaire investor my brother-in-law was desperately waiting to impress that night was actually the man I was going to marry. When the heavy mahogany doors finally opened and that billionaire walked straight over to kiss my cheek, the smug smiles in that room vanished instantly. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old. Before I tell you exactly how I sent my arrogant brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary and watched my toxic family lose everything they valued most, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family that constantly underestimated your worth. You will want to hear every single detail of how this night ended. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta, our African-American family was obsessed with appearances. My parents built a flawless facade of perfection. Behind the gates of our estate, however, the emotional reality was suffocating. My younger sister Chloe was the golden child. She was the pageant queen, the cheerleader, the one who never had to work for anything but received endless praise simply for existing. I was the scapegoat, the quiet daughter who preferred reading financial statements over attending socialite luncheons. While I spent my 20s building a grueling career as a forensic auditor, dismantling complex financial frauds for ultra-wealthy clients, Chloe meanwhile spent her time marrying Bradley. Bradley was a 34-year-old white real estate developer who talked an incredibly big game. He loved using corporate buzzwords, acting like he was the ultimate savior of our family wealth. He carried himself with an unearned superiority, constantly mansplaining basic business concepts to anyone who would listen. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. They viewed my analytical mind and my quiet independence as a massive failure. To them, a woman was only as successful as the wealthy man standing next to her. It was the night of my parents' ruby anniversary party. They had rented out the entire first floor of the most exclusive country club in the city, a place where image was the only currency that mattered. I arrived straight from a demanding week of corporate audits. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit. I dressed for power, not for pageantry. But in my family, my lack of a sparkling designer gown and a rich husband on my arm meant I was a total embarrassment. The moment I pushed open the heavy double doors of the ballroom, the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to fade into a dense, heavy silence. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over 50 guests dressed in their absolute best. I took a steady breath and stepped inside, holding my head high. I had barely taken 3 steps onto the polished marble floor when the mockery began. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." Chloe's voice rang out sharply. She was standing near the center ice sculpture, draped in an emerald silk dress that cost more than my first car. She leaned into her group of friends and cousins, her eyes flashing with that familiar malicious spark. "And she is flying solo as always. Honestly, I would feel bad for her if she wasn't such a walking spreadsheet. I guess nobody wanted to spend their Saturday night with a human calculator." Laughter erupted around her. My own cousins, aunts, and family friends chuckled, shaking their heads in agreement. Not a single person offered a defense. My chest tightened, a familiar ache radiating through my ribs. For a fraction of a second, I felt like that little girl again, crying alone in her bedroom while the rest of the house celebrated downstairs. But I was no longer a helpless child seeking their conditional love. I was a senior partner at a major venture capital firm, and I held the keys to their entire financial future in my handbag. I maintained a polite, impenetrable smile, feeling the cold weight of the audit documents resting inside my leather briefcase, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I navigated through the sea of relatives, making my way toward the extravagant gift table, draped in white satin, near the back of the room. I carefully set down the custom wooden box containing the 1982 vintage Bordeaux. It had taken me 3 months of calling private collectors across the country to track down that exact bottle simply because my father once casually mentioned it was his ultimate dream to taste it. But as I placed it next to a towering stack of perfectly wrapped boxes, my parents didn't even look in my direction. They were standing just a few feet away, completely captivated by Bradley, my father. Marcus, a man who usually demanded absolute decorum and respect, was laughing loudly at one of Bradley's terrible jokes. My mother, Brenda, was lightly touching Bradley's arm, her face glowing with the kind of deep, unconditional pride she had never once directed at me. Bradley was holding court, loudly bragging about a massive new real estate acquisition that was supposedly going to double their retirement portfolio. He kept throwing around meaningless corporate words while my parents nodded along as if he were a financial genius. Chloe stood right beside him, beaming proudly, playing the role of the perfect supportive trophy wife. I stepped closer, waiting for a brief pause in the conversation so I could wish them a happy anniversary. My mother finally noticed me standing there. The warm, radiant smile she had just given her son-in-law vanished the exact second her eyes met mine. Her expression hardened into a familiar mask of disappointment. Her gaze slowly dropped from my face, down to my charcoal suit, taking in the sharp, tailored lines and my practical leather heels. She let out a soft, sharp sigh that was perfectly calculated to be loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Nia," she said, her tone dripping with passive-aggressive pity. "I see you came straight from the office again. Could you really not find the time or the decency to put on something appropriate for a formal evening?" I opened my mouth to speak, but she held up a hand to stop me, immediately pivoting to gesture toward my sister. "Just look at Chloe. She spent hours getting ready for us today. That emerald dress is a designer piece. It shows respect for our family image and the effort we put into this party. But you walk in here looking like you are about to depose someone in a drab corporate conference room. It is no wonder you had to come alone tonight. Men want a woman who knows how to soften up, not someone who treats every dinner party like a board meeting." A few aunts standing nearby paused their conversations to listen, their eyes raking over me with quiet, heavy judgment. My father barely glanced at me before turning back to his scotch glass, offering a silent endorsement of my mother's public cruelty. He didn't ask about my week. He didn't acknowledge the rare gift sitting on the table behind me. Bradley smirked, pulling Chloe closer by her waist, visibly soaking up the validation that he had chosen the superior daughter. In the past, a public dressing down like this would have sent me rushing to the nearest bathroom to dry my tears. My mother knew exactly how to weaponize her disapproval to keep me feeling small and inadequate. She wanted me to apologize, to shrink my presence, to feel overwhelmingly grateful that I was even allowed in the room with them. I looked at the vintage wine I had just placed on the table, a symbol of a daughter desperately trying to buy her father's affection, and then I looked back at my mother's harsh, judging eyes. I didn't apologize. I didn't shrink. I simply smoothed the lapel of my perfectly tailored jacket and smiled a tight, knowing smile. I told her I dressed for the business at hand, and tonight I had very important business to attend to. I watched her perfectly arched eyebrows furrow in confusion, but before she could formulate another insult, Bradley took it upon himself to intervene. Bradley puffed out his chest, stepping forward, with his arm draped possessively around Chloe's waist. But it was Chloe who spoke first, eager to reclaim the spotlight that my brief defiance had threatened to steal. She clinked her crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon, the sharp ringing sound cutting through the low murmur of the ballroom. "Everyone, if I could just have your attention for a tiny moment," Chloe announced, her voice projecting with practiced theatricality. The relatives immediately gravitated toward her, forming a tight, adoring circle. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. People turned their backs to me, closing the physical gap to surround Chloe and Bradley, effectively boxing me out. I stood on the outer edge of the gathering, watching the scene unfold like a perfectly choreographed tragedy. The lavishness of the ballroom with its glittering chandeliers and towering floral arrangements felt like a pathetic contrast to the profound ugliness of the people standing inside it. "Tonight is strictly about honoring Mom and Dad," Chloe continued, placing a delicate hand over her heart. "But Bradley and I have a tiny surprise that we simply cannot keep a secret for another minute. As many of you know, my brilliant husband has been working tirelessly on a massive new commercial development downtown. Well, tonight we are officially celebrating. The most prominent venture capitalist in the country, Julian Pierce, is joining our party this evening to personally finalize a $50 million funding round for Bradley's firm. Gasps of absolute adoration rippled through the crowd of relatives. My father clapped Bradley on the back so hard his scotch sloshed over the rim of his glass. My mother pressed both hands to her cheeks, her eyes shining with tears of genuine pride. $50 million, Aunt Shirley repeated loudly, fanning herself with a cocktail napkin to make sure everyone heard the massive number. Lord have mercy, we have a true visionary in the family. We are so incredibly blessed. Chloe let the wave of praise wash over her, basking in the validation she craved like oxygen. Once the congratulations died down, her eyes found mine again, glittering with fresh malice. The entire room seemed to pivot with her aiming their collective attention directly at my perceived failures. It is just incredible. Chloe sighed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and weaponized concern. Bradley is out here literally reshaping the city skyline, building actual generational wealth for our family. And Nia, well, Nia is still just crunching numbers for other people. Tell me, Nia, doesn't it get incredibly depressing sitting in a gray cubicle all day looking at spreadsheets counting millions of dollars that will never actually belong to you? A chorus of condescending murmurs swept through our relatives. The alliance was formed instantly, an unspoken agreement to tear me down to elevate the golden child. Aunt Shirley shook her head, adjusting her heavy pearl necklace. You really should have listened to your mother and found yourself a wealthy man in college, Nia. All those late nights studying, all those canceled family vacations, and for what an accounting job. You can't hug a ledger at night. My cousin Kevin laughed out loud, pointing a half-empty glass in my direction. Hey, don't knock it, Aunt Shirley. Somebody has to use the calculator. Maybe if Nia asks nicely, Bradley will let her do the basic bookkeeping for his new skyscraper. At least she would get to see what real money looks like. Bradley chuckled, holding up a hand in a display of mock humility. Now, let's not be too hard on Nia. The corporate grunts are the absolute backbone of the economy. They do the tedious, mind-numbing, busy work so that true innovators and market disruptors like me can focus on the big picture. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was palpable. He actually believed his own lies. He believed he was the untouchable white savior of this affluent black family. And my family, so blinded by their desperation to align themselves with his perceived power, wealth, and whiteness, swallowed every single word without a second thought. They never ran a background check. They never asked for proof. They just handed over their blind loyalty. My mother stepped in not to defend me, but to twist the knife even deeper. Bradley is being too kind to you, Nia. You should be taking notes instead of standing there looking so defensive. You could learn a lot from him about ambition and drive. We are just so worried about your future. You are 32, entirely single, and stuck in a dead-end career. It absolutely breaks my heart to see you struggling to survive while your sister is thriving so beautifully. The irony was so potent, I could almost taste it. Struggling, thriving. I watched my mother look at me with genuine pity. I watched Chloe beam with vicious triumph. I watched Bradley puff out his chest like a proud peacock, absolutely certain of his dominance. I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I remained a statue of absolute composure, my eyes razor sharp. To them, I was just a sad, isolated spinster in a cheap suit absorbing their blows. But behind my calm exterior, my mind was running a ruthless, precise audit of the room. I watched Bradley soak up the praise, completely unaware that I had spent the last 3 weeks dissecting his entire financial existence. I knew about the hidden shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I knew about the forged signatures on the loan documents. I knew that the $50 million deal he was bragging about was a desperate, fabricated illusion meant to cover up a massive Ponzi scheme that was days away from total collapse. And most importantly, I knew that Julian Pierce, the untouchable billionaire he was practically worshipping, was not coming here tonight to shake his hand. My silence deeply unsettled them, though they tried their best not to show it. When a victim refuses to bleed, the bullies immediately lose their power. I let my gaze travel slowly from Bradley's custom-tailored tuxedo down to his polished leather shoes and then back up to his smug face. I gave him a slow, chillingly calm smile. It was the exact smile a predator gives right before the steel trap snaps completely shut. All right, ladies, let's bring the temperature down a notch, Bradley interjected, stepping between my mother and me with the exaggerated swagger of a referee breaking up a title fight. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, his grip just tight enough to be a physical display of dominance. Brenda, why don't you go grab us some more of those crab cakes? Let me talk to Nia for a second. Just brother to sister. My mother immediately softened her rigid posture, melting into a compliant, admiring stance. Of course, Bradley, you always know how to keep the peace. She shot me one last warning glare before disappearing into the crowd, completely eager to serve the man who was actively destroying our family finances. As soon as she was out of earshot, Bradley steered me away from the gift table and toward a quiet alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. He let out a loud theatrical sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair. He leaned against the glass, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass, and looked at me with an expression of profound, unearned pity. "Look, Nia, you have to understand where your mother is coming from," Bradley began, his tone dropping an octave into what he clearly believed was a soothing, authoritative register. "She sees Chloe and me building an empire, and then she looks at you. You are smart. You are a hard worker, but you have a poor person's mindset. You are trapped in the rat race." I stared at him, my face completely neutral. I was a senior partner at a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm, and this man whose entire company was currently structured like a house of cards in a hurricane was about to give me financial advice. "You see, the problem with traditional education, like your little accounting degree, is that it teaches you to be a wage slave." Bradley continued, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You trade your hours for a paycheck. But true wealth, generational wealth, is about leverage. It's about liquidity. Do you know what cash flow is, Nia?" He actually paused, waiting for me to answer. He was standing there, a man drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, asking a forensic auditor if she understood cash flow. "I am familiar with the concept," I replied evenly, keeping my voice entirely devoid of sarcasm. "Being familiar is not enough," he said, shaking his head with a condescending chuckle. "You have to live it. Right now, you are letting your money rot in a savings account, getting eaten alive by inflation. You are playing it safe. And playing it safe is the most dangerous thing you can do in this economy. I want to help you, Nia. I really do. Chloe and I feel bad for you. We see you living in your little apartment driving that basic sedan, and we want to pull you up." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The smell of expensive cologne and cheap whiskey washed over me. "I have an opportunity for you," he said, his eyes darting around the room as if he were sharing a massive state secret. "You know Julian Pierce is coming tonight. The man is a legend in the venture capital world. He manages billions. In about an hour, he is walking through those doors to finalize a $50 million funding round for my commercial real estate startup. Once that ink dries, my company valuation skyrockets to $250 million overnight." I nodded slowly, letting him spin his intricate web of lies. I knew for an absolute fact that his startup had zero revenue, no permits for the land he claimed to be developing, and was currently under investigation by 2 different federal agencies. But I let him talk. "I'm opening up a friends and family round, and strictly off the books just for tonight," Bradley whispered, tapping his temple as if he were a certified genius. "I know you have about $50,000 saved up. Chloe mentioned you were looking at buying a starter home. Don't do that. Real estate is for suckers, unless you are the one developing it. Wire that $50,000 into my holding account tonight, and I will give you a 5% equity stake in the Julian Pierce deal." He leaned back, crossing his arms, waiting for me to fall to my knees in gratitude. 5% of a $50 million valuation for $50,000. The math was so incredibly insulting, so blatantly predatory, that it actually took my breath away. He wasn't just trying to steal from me. He genuinely thought I was incredibly stupid. $50,000, I repeated slowly, letting the number hang in the air. "It is a steal," Bradley assured me, his smile widening. "Normally, my minimum buy-in for outside investors is $500,000, but you are family. I want to see you win, Nia. I want to see you quit that depressing corporate job and actually live a little. Imagine the look on your mother's face when you roll up to Thanksgiving in a Porsche. I can make that happen for you." I looked at the sweat gathering at his hairline. Despite his confident posture, his pupils were slightly dilated and his breathing was shallow. He was desperate. I had analyzed his bank records 3 days ago. He had a balloon payment of exactly $48,000 due on a high-interest predatory loan by Monday morning. If he didn't pay it, his luxury cars were going to be repossessed. He was trying to drain my life savings to cover his own catastrophic failures, dressing up his theft as a massive favor. "That is a very generous offer, Bradley," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calibrated. "But 5% equity on a $50 million raise implies a post-money valuation that doesn't quite align with a $50,000 buy-in. Furthermore, if you are closing a deal with Pierce Holdings tonight, accepting unaccredited investor funds through an off-the-books transaction would violate federal securities regulations. Have your lawyers drafted the revised capitalization table to reflect my entry?" For a split second, the smug mask slipped. His eyes widened, and a flash of genuine panic crossed his face. He had expected me to be dazzled by the big numbers, not to hit him with corporate compliance laws. But the arrogance of a mediocre man is a powerful shield. He quickly recovered, letting out a loud, patronizing laugh that sounded more like a nervous bark. "Listen to you throwing around textbook terms," Bradley sneered, shaking his head. "This is exactly why you are stuck in middle management. Nia, you are too obsessed with the red tape. In the real world, the movers and the shakers don't wait for lawyers to draft paperwork. We make handshake deals. We move fast and break things. Julian Pierce operates the exact same way. That is why he and I see eye to eye." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Julian Pierce, the man who scrutinized every single decimal point in a contract and fired executives for rounding errors, did not make handshake deals. "I am giving you a golden ticket, Nia," Bradley said, his tone turning slightly aggressive. The friendly brother-in-law act was fading, replaced by the desperate con artist beneath. "You have until the end of the night to transfer those funds. Once Julian walks in here and signs that term sheet, the door closes forever. Don't let your rigid, pathetic little mindset keep you poor for the rest of your life." He took a final sip of his whiskey, pointing a sharp finger directly at my chest. "Think about it. Be smart for once in your life." He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd of adoring relatives, ready to play the wealthy savior once again. I stood by the window looking out at the manicured lawns, feeling the cold weight of the documents resting inside my briefcase. I didn't need to think about it. I just needed to wait for the collision. I didn't have to wait long. The moment Bradley melted back into the crowd, my parents flanked me. My father blocked the narrow path back to the main ballroom, while my mother stepped directly into my personal space. It was a classic pincer movement, a physical intimidation tactic they had used since I was a teenager whenever they needed to force my compliance. The heavy scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume mixed with the sharp smell of my father's scotch, creating a suffocating cloud around me. "I hope you listened closely to what that man just offered you." My father said, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "Bradley is handing you a golden ticket on a silver platter. You would have to be an absolute fool to turn him down." My mother nodded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "We saw you being difficult, Nia. We could see the stubborn attitude written all over your face from across the room. Bradley is trying to include you in a historic family victory, and you are treating him like he is trying to sell you a used car." I kept my expression perfectly blank, refusing to give them the reaction they were so desperate to extract. "I am simply doing my due diligence," I replied, my voice steady. "It is $50,000 of my hard-earned savings. I am not going to blindly hand it over without looking at a single financial statement or consulting a lawyer." "Financials," my mother scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I had just said the most ridiculous word in the English language. "You want to talk about financials to a man who is closing a $50 million deal tonight. You are so incredibly arrogant, Nia. You think that just because you look at spreadsheets all day, you are smarter than a man who is actually building real wealth. Do you want to know what real family loyalty looks like? She leaned in closer, dropping her voice so the passing waiters wouldn't overhear. Your father and I remortgaged this house. We pulled $2 million in equity and wired it directly into Bradley's holding company last week. The breath temporarily left my lungs. I already knew this, of course. I had seen the forged signatures and the horrific loan terms during my forensic audit of Bradley's accounts. But hearing my own mother say it so casually, looking so incredibly proud of herself as she confessed to gambling away her entire life's foundation, was genuinely sickening. You remortgaged the house, I repeated, forcing my voice to sound shocked. The house that Grandpa Theodore helped you buy. The house that was supposed to be completely paid off by now. It is called a bridge loan, my father interrupted sharply, using another one of Bradley's favorite buzzwords. It is a temporary reallocation of assets. Bradley is going to double our money in less than 6 months. Julian Pierce is signing the final funding paperwork tonight. We are securing a massive, luxurious retirement for ourselves, and we are securing a permanent legacy for Chloe. My mother reached out and jabbed a manicured finger hard against my shoulder. Now it is your turn to step up, she demanded, dropping all pretenses of a polite conversation. Bradley needs a little extra liquidity to cover the immediate closing costs and the legal retainers for the Pierce deal. $50,000 is absolutely nothing compared to what your father and I just put on the line. You are going to transfer that money into his account tonight. You are going to be a team player for once in your miserable life. I looked at the two of them. I looked at the Psaya. These were the people who were supposed to protect me. Instead, they were acting as willing enforcers for a con artist eager to drain my bank account to feed a parasite who didn't care if they all ended up sleeping on the street. No, I said softly but with absolute finality. I am not giving him a single dime. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. My mother actually gasped, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. You selfish, ungrateful little wretch! My mother hissed, her face contorting with a rage so ugly it completely ruined her polished exterior. You have always been like this. You are so horribly bitter and jealous of your sister that you would rather see her husband fail than help this family succeed. You are just angry because Chloe found a successful, handsome man to take care of her while you are entirely alone. My father added his words designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. You sit in your empty apartment counting other people's money, pretending you are so independent. But the truth is nobody wants you. You are 32 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for it except a miserable attitude and a cheap suit. My mother stepped right back into my face, her voice trembling with venom. Bradley was right about you. You have a poverty mindset. You are going to die alone and broke because you are too arrogant to accept help from your betters. If you do not wire that money to Bradley tonight, don't bother calling us for the holidays. You are completely cut off. I felt my fingernails digging deeply into the palms of my hands. I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their demand sent a surge of pure adrenaline through my veins. They were threatening to cut me off. They were standing in a house that was 30 days away from foreclosure, wearing clothes bought with stolen money, threatening to abandon the only person in the room who actually had the power to save them. For a fraction of a second, a tiny part of me wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to open my briefcase, pull out the audit reports, and shove the undeniable proof of Bradley's massive Ponzi scheme right into their faces. I wanted to watch their smug, superior expressions crumble into absolute terror as they realized they had handed their entire life savings to a criminal. But I didn't. I took a slow, deep breath, releasing the tension in my hands. The anger evaporated, replaced by an absolute icy clarity. They had made their choice. They had chosen the golden child and the white savior over their own flesh and blood. They had willingly offered me up as a sacrifice to fund their delusions of grandeur. There was no more guilt. There was no more longing for a family that never truly existed. I owed them absolutely nothing. I promise you, I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through my mother's hysterical breathing. By the time this party is over, everyone in this room will get exactly what they deserve. My parents stared at me, visibly unnerved by my complete lack of emotion. They had expected tears. They had expected me to crumble under the weight of their rejection. They didn't know how to handle a woman who was no longer afraid of them. Before my father could launch into another tirade, a sudden massive shift in the atmosphere swept through the ballroom. The low murmur of conversation abruptly died. The soft jazz music seemed to fade into nothingness. Even the clinking of champagne glasses stopped entirely. My parents slowly turned their heads toward the grand entrance, their anger instantly forgotten, replaced by a desperate, hungry anticipation. The heavy mahogany doors had been pulled wide open by the club staff. The collision I had been waiting for had finally arrived. A man stepped across the threshold, and the entire ballroom collectively held its breath. Julian Pierce did not just enter a room. He altered the gravitational pull of it. At 38 years old, he was a towering figure of quiet, ruthless authority. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders, a stark contrast to the flashy, ill-fitting tuxedos worn by the other men in the room. There was no entourage surrounding him. There were no frantic assistants buzzing around his personal space. He didn't need them. He possessed the kind of authentic masculine power that didn't require volume or an audience to be felt. As he stood in the grand entrance, his sharp, dark eyes slowly scanned the crowded room. The soft chatter that usually filled the country club evaporated instantly. The jazz quartet playing in the corner actually missed a beat, the saxophone player lowering his instrument mid-note as he recognized the man standing by the doors. Whispers ripped through the crowd of relatives and family friends like a sudden gust of wind. People were elbowing each other, pointing discreetly, their faces pale with absolute shock. Everyone in that room, from my status-obsessed mother to my wealthiest cousins, knew exactly who Julian Pierce was. He was regular cover material for elite financial magazines. He was the man who could make or break entire industries with a single phone call. And he was standing right there in their rented suburban ballroom. I watched my parents absolutely freeze in front of me. My mother's hand flew to her chest, her manicured fingers clutching her heavy pearl necklace as if she were trying to restart her own heart. My father's jaw went slack. All the venom and rage from our previous argument vanished, completely wiped away by the sheer magnitude of the wealth standing at the door. He stared at Julian with a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. In their minds, their massive, reckless gamble had just paid off. The $2 million they had secretly pulled from their own retirement fund was finally justified. The billionaire had arrived just as their golden son-in-law had promised. Across the room, Chloe let out a high-pitched squeal of delight that was impossible to ignore. She grabbed the arm of her nearest friend, pointing excitedly toward the entrance, already playing the role of the triumphant visionary's wife. She smoothed down the front of her emerald designer dress, preparing to be photographed next to greatness. But no one in the room was more deeply affected than Bradley. When Bradley saw Julian walk through those heavy oak doors, his entire posture transformed. The nervous, greasy sweat that had been gathering at his hairline seemed to instantly evaporate, replaced by a blinding, arrogant euphoria. He puffed out his chest, his face stretching into a massive, triumphant grin. He looked around the room, making sure every single person was watching him. He locked eyes with my father and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a silent victory lap, a look that screamed, "I told you I was the ultimate savior of this family." Bradley couldn't contain his excitement for another second. He needed to claim his prize immediately. He needed everyone in that room to see the billionaire acknowledge him as an absolute equal. He took a step forward, moving so quickly and recklessly that his hip clipped the edge of a heavy glass cocktail table. A velvet-upholstered chair was caught in his path, and he knocked it completely over. The heavy wooden legs hit the polished marble floor with a loud, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly silent room. But Bradley didn't even flinch. He didn't look down at the mess he made. He didn't pause to apologize to the startled guests, who had to rapidly jump out of his way to avoid the falling furniture. He just kept walking, picking up his pace, until he was practically jogging across the center of the ballroom. He was a man rushing toward his own magnificent coronation. I stood rooted to my spot near the large glass windows, watching the entire spectacle unfold with absolute, chilling serenity. I watched Bradley quickly adjust the lapels of his jacket, running a frantic hand through his blonde hair to make sure he looked the part of a highly successful tech founder. He was so completely consumed by his own delusion, so drunk on the validation of the room, that he failed to notice the subtle shift in Julian's demeanor. He failed to see that Julian's eyes had stopped scanning the crowd the exact second they found me standing alone in the back corner. Aunt Shirley and my cousin Kevin, who had just spent the last 20 minutes mocking my career and my outfit, were now watching Bradley with open mouths, totally hypnotized by the spectacle. They parted like the Red Sea to let him through. Bradley strutted past them, his ego expanding with every single step. He believed that this was the moment his lies became reality. He believed that if he acted confident enough, the billionaire would simply play along and hand over a $50 million check. Bradley reached the center of the room, throwing his arms out wide in a grandiose gesture of exaggerated familiarity. He projected his voice so loudly that it bounced off the vaulted ceilings, ensuring that every single aunt, uncle, and cousin heard his moment of supreme victory. "Julian!" he shouted, his voice dripping with forced camaraderie and desperate enthusiasm. "Julian, my man, you actually made it to the party." Bradley closed the final few feet between them, his arms spread as wide as they could physically go. He was going in for the full embrace. He didn't want a professional, respectful handshake. He wanted a backslapping hug. He desperately wanted to show the entire room that he and the billionaire were close personal friends who operated on the exact same wavelength. He wanted to show my parents that their $2 million sacrifice had bought them a permanent seat at the ultimate table of corporate power. He leaned forward, a smug, untouchable smile plastered across his face. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to step directly off a cliff. Bradley held his breath, his arms fully extended like a man waiting to catch a falling bag of gold. He had rehearsed this exact moment in his mind 1,000 times. He was completely ready for the firm, validating handshake, the masculine pat on the back, and the loud, boisterous greeting that would permanently cement his status as the undisputed king of our family. He leaned his weight forward, a massive, triumphant grin stretching across his flushed face, fully prepared to bask in the blinding glow of the billionaire's attention. But Julian didn't slow down. He didn't extend a hand. He didn't even blink. With the effortless, fluid motion of a man who was accustomed to moving through crowded spaces without ever being obstructed, Julian simply shifted his weight to the left. It was a microscopic adjustment, a casual pivot of his broad shoulders, but it was executed with such devastating precision that Bradley was left grasping at completely empty air. The billionaire glided right past him like a luxury ocean liner, completely bypassing a drowning man on a tiny wooden raft. There was absolutely no malice in Julian's movement. That was the most deeply humiliating part of the entire exchange. Malice would have implied that Bradley was actually important enough to be hated or deliberately slighted. Instead, Julian treated him with the profound, chilling indifference one usually reserves for a misplaced coat rack. Bradley stumbled forward a fraction of an inch, thrown completely off balance by his own unreciprocated momentum. His empty arms hung in the air for a painful, agonizing second before he awkwardly pulled them back to his chest. The arrogant smile froze on his face, rapidly decaying into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. He let out a nervous, breathless chuckle, turning his head sharply, fully expecting Julian to stop, turn around, and laugh off the apparent miscommunication. But Julian kept walking. The heavy silence in the ballroom deepened, transforming instantly from starstruck awe into a sharp, suffocating tension. The massive crowd of relatives who had just been treating Bradley like a conquering hero now watched in absolute bewilderment as the billionaire completely ignored his existence. Julian moved through the room with a quiet, predatory grace. My mother, Brenda, quickly stepped forward from the crowd, frantically smoothing the front of her dress. She desperately prepared a radiant, welcoming smile, assuming that perhaps Julian was simply bypassing the son-in-law to pay his respects to the hosts of the anniversary party first. She opened her mouth to welcome him, her eyes wide with eager, hungry anticipation. Julian walked right past her without a single glance. He walked past my father, whose heavy Scotch glass was now trembling visibly in his tight grip. He walked past Chloe, who was standing completely frozen in her expensive emerald dress, her practiced, camera-ready smile slowly slipping right off her perfectly contoured face. Julian was not looking at the sparkling crystal chandeliers. He was not looking at the lavish anniversary decorations, the towering floral arrangements, or the extravagant tables stacked with expensive gifts. His dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on me. The crowd naturally parted for him, stepping aside as if they were reacting to an invisible magnetic field. I stood in my quiet, isolated corner by the large glass windows, maintaining my steady, impassive posture. My heart was beating with a strong, rhythmic thud against my ribs, but outwardly I was a statue of absolute calm. I watched the most powerful man in the room cross the polished marble floor and walk directly into the space my family had so deliberately isolated me in. When Julian finally reached me, the cold, impenetrable aura that surrounded him instantly dissolved. The razor-sharp edge in his eyes softened into something warm, gentle, and intimately familiar. He didn't offer me a professional handshake. He didn't treat me like an employee, a subordinate, or a stranger. He stepped directly into my personal space, closing the distance between us with a natural, effortless intimacy that could not be faked. He placed a large, warm hand gently on my waist, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against my cheek. The faint, familiar scent of his cedar and bergamot cologne wrapped around me, grounding me perfectly in the chaotic, buzzing energy of the room. "Sorry I'm late, darling," he murmured, keeping his hand resting comfortably on my waist as he pulled back to look at me. His voice was a rich, deep baritone that carried perfectly in the dead silence of the ballroom. The board meeting ran long. They kept arguing over the European acquisitions. Those 2 sentences struck the room with the devastating force of a seismic event. Darling. The casual term of endearment hung heavily in the air, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, completely shattering the carefully constructed reality of every single person standing in that room. The collective gasp from my family was loud and perfectly audible. I saw Aunt Shirley actually drop her cocktail napkin, her jaw unhinged in absolute disbelief as she stared at us. My cousin Kevin looked like he had just been struck by physical lightning. My mother was standing completely rigid, her eyes darting frantically between my calm face and Julian's expensive hand resting securely on my waist. Her brain was entirely failing to process the impossible image right in front of her. The daughter she had just banished, the woman she had just condemned as a pathetic, isolated failure with the poverty mindset, was standing shoulder to shoulder with the very man they all viewed as a literal god. But the true masterpiece of the moment was Bradley. He was still standing in the dead center of the room, right where Julian had abandoned him. He slowly rotated on his heels, his highly polished leather shoes squeaking slightly on the pristine marble floor. His face had lost every single drop of its color, turning a sickly pale shade of gray. The confident, condescending tech founder, who had just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively mansplaining cash flow to me, was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, trembling little man whose entire manufactured universe was rapidly collapsing in on itself. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting wildly around the room before finally locking directly onto me. He looked at my calm, unbothered expression. He looked at the protective, deeply affectionate way Julian stood beside me. And in that singular, agonizing moment, I saw the exact second Bradley realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. He remembered the arrogant speech he had just given me by the window. He remembered trying to con me out of my $50,000 savings. He suddenly realized he was not the apex predator in this room. He was the prey, and he had just tried to aggressively scam the woman who held his absolute destruction in the palm of her hand. Julian slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes finally acknowledging Bradley's existence for the first time since he walked into the room. The billionaire looked at the pale, trembling man standing a few feet away with an expression of mild, detached curiosity, the way a scientist might study a particularly uninteresting insect under a microscope. He didn't let go of my waist. In fact, his grip tightened just slightly in a silent display of absolute solidarity. "Mr. Pierce." Bradley finally managed to croak, his voice cracking horribly. He cleared his throat desperately, trying to summon back the arrogant tech founder persona he had been wearing just moments ago, but the sound that came out was thin and reedy. "Mr. Pierce, it is an absolute honor. I am Bradley. We were supposed to finalize the funding round tonight." Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between Julian and me. He forced a strained, deeply uncomfortable laugh, wiping the gathering sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I am sorry, I am just a little confused. How exactly do you know Nia?" "She is my sister-in-law. She is just a low-level clerk at some corporate accounting firm downtown." The moment the words left his mouth, a collective cringe seemed to ripple through the room. My mother closed her eyes tightly, recognizing instantly that Bradley had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. Even Chloe, who usually lacked any basic awareness of social dynamics, took a small, hesitant step backward. Julian raised a single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow. A low, dangerous chuckle rumbled in his chest. "Low-level clerk." He repeated the words slowly, letting the sheer absurdity of the statement hang in the heavy air of the ballroom. "Is that what you told them, darling? That is incredibly modest of you." Julian turned his head slightly to look down at me, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of amusement and deep, unwavering respect. "I suppose dismantling multi-million-dollar corporate frauds before breakfast does lack a certain glamour." He then turned his attention back to Bradley. The amusement vanished instantly from his face, replaced by a cold, terrifying authority. "Nia is not a low-level clerk. Nia is a senior partner at Pierce Holdings. She is the head of our Global Risk Assessment and Forensic Auditing Division. In fact, she personally oversees the final approval for every single venture capital investment our firm makes that exceeds $10 million. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that occurs precisely 1 second after a bomb goes off before the shockwave actually hits. My father, who was still clutching his glass of scotch, went entirely rigid. The color drained completely from his face as the mathematical reality of his $2 million gamble suddenly crashed down on him. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying to her mouth in pure horror. Aunt Shirley, Cousin Kevin, and the rest of the relatives who had spent the last hour treating me like a pathetic, isolated failure were now staring at me with expressions of abject terror. Bradley staggered back half a step, his polished shoes squeaking loudly against the marble. "No," he whispered, shaking his head frantically. "No, that is impossible. I met with your acquisition team last week. They said the final decision was entirely up to the silent partner. They said the silent partner was reviewing my financials." Julian smiled, but it was a smile completely devoid of warmth. "That is correct, and you are currently looking directly at her. Nia is the silent partner. She has been reviewing your financials for the past 3 weeks." Bradley's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed the edge of a nearby cocktail table to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The realization was hitting him in brutal, agonizing waves. He had not just insulted his sister-in-law. He had spent the last hour actively trying to scam the exact person who held the absolute power to either fund his massive real estate project or completely destroy him. He had condescendingly mansplained cash flow to the woman who controlled a multi-billion-dollar venture capital fund. "But I submitted my application to Pierce Holdings months ago," Bradley stammered, his voice rising in panic. "If she was the senior partner, why didn't she say anything? Why did she let me stand here and talk to her like that?" Julian let out a slow, heavy sigh, looking at Bradley with utter disdain. "Because Bradley, unlike you, Nia actually understands the concept of professional discretion. She also understands the legal necessity of keeping personal relationships entirely separate from rigorous corporate audits. Though after reviewing the preliminary report she handed me this afternoon, I am starting to understand why you were so desperate to secure $50 million tonight without a proper legal review." Bradley opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to spin another lie, but the words died in his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide and completely terrified, silently begging for a lifeline that he knew he didn't deserve. I finally stepped forward, moving smoothly out from under Julian's protective arm. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal suit, feeling the satisfying heavy weight of the audit documents resting inside my briefcase nearby. The power dynamic in the room had entirely shifted. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the quiet daughter desperate for approval. I was the executioner, and the blade was finally ready to drop. "You should have taken my advice about the lawyer Bradley. I said, my voice perfectly calm, ringing out clearly in the dead silence of the room. Because when I told you I was doing my due diligence, I wasn't talking about your pathetic $50,000 shakedown. I was talking about the massive systematic fraud you have been running for the past 2 years. My mother let out a sharp, piercing cry. Nia, stop it! You are ruining everything! You are ruining your sister's life! I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with this woman who had just threatened to cut me out of the family forever. I am not ruining anything, Mother. I am simply reading the balance sheet. And unfortunately for everyone in this room, the math never lies. Before my mother could launch into another hysterical defense of her precious son-in-law, the sharp, elegant chime of a crystal glass being tapped echoed across the room. The country club maitre d' stepped up to the microphone, seamlessly announcing that the formal anniversary dinner was now being served in the adjoining banquet hall. The timing was almost poetic. The grand revelation had completely sucked the oxygen out of the room, and now my family was forced to swallow their absolute terror and march into a 5-course plated dinner, as if the world had not just shifted beneath their feet. Julian rested his hand lightly on the small of my back, guiding me toward the grand double doors of the dining room. The crowd of relatives parted for us once again, but this time the whispers were entirely different. There was no mockery. There was only a thick, suffocating blanket of awe and fear. We approached the head table, an extravagant setup draped in white silk and covered in cascading white orchids. Traditionally, the anniversary couple sat in the center, flanked by their children, but the seating arrangement suddenly felt like a massive political chessboard. Julian gracefully pulled out a high-backed mahogany chair for me, taking the seat directly to my right. Within seconds, the frantic scrambling began. My parents, who had ignored me for the entire first hour of the party, practically shoved their way past Aunt Shirley to claim the seats directly across from us. Chloe and Bradley hurried to take the chairs right next to them. Bradley moved like a man walking to his own execution. He kept his eyes glued to the expensive china plate in front of him, his face still a terrifying shade of gray. The moment the first course of lobster bisque was placed in front of us, the massive, shameless pivot began. My mother leaned forward, her face stretched into a smile so wide and desperate it actually looked painful. She reached across the table, completely ignoring the country club servers, and personally adjusted my silver water goblet. "Nia, sweetheart," my mother cooed, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet tone I hadn't heard directed at me since I was a toddler. "You absolutely have to try the imported butter with this bread. It is phenomenal. I specifically made sure they seated you at the head table because I wanted my 2 beautiful daughters right by my side tonight." I slowly picked up my spoon, meeting her frantic gaze with absolute emotional detachment. "You wanted me by your side," I repeated flatly. "Just 20 minutes ago, you told me I was a selfish wretch who was going to die alone and broke. You literally threatened to cut me out of the family if I didn't hand over my savings to Bradley." My mother let out a loud theatrical laugh, waving her hand in the air as if she were swatting away a pesky fly. "Oh, Nia, please. You know how highly emotional I get. I was just teasing you. We were all just engaging in a little family banter to get a rise out of you. You have always taken things entirely too seriously. Your father and I have always known you are destined for absolute greatness. We just wanted to push you to realize your full potential." The sheer audacity of her gaslighting was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite decades of emotional abuse and a literal extortion attempt as motivational parenting. Chloe chimed in next, leaning across Bradley to flash me a brilliant, perfectly glossed smile. "Honestly, Nia, I was telling Bradley just the other day how incredibly chic your professional style is. That charcoal suit is so powerful, it screams CEO. I always knew you were doing big things downtown. You are the smartest person in this entire family." This was the same sister who less than an hour ago had loudly called me a walking spreadsheet and a human calculator. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable, desperate mess they had created. Julian sat beside me, eating his meal with quiet elegance, observing the pathetic display of sycophancy with cold amusement. He didn't say a single word to them, which only made them sweat even more. When the main course of filet mignon arrived, the pleasantries were abruptly tossed aside. The desperation had reached a boiling point. My father set his fork down, clearing his throat loudly. He shot a nervous glance at Julian before leaning heavily over the table toward me. "So, Nia," my father began, attempting to use his authoritative patriarch voice, though it cracked slightly under the immense pressure. "Let us talk about family business. Since you are the silent partner at Pierce Holdings, that means you and Julian hold the keys to the kingdom. We are incredibly proud of you, honey. We really are. But we need to discuss Bradley's commercial real estate project. The deadline for the $50 million funding round is tonight." He gestured toward Bradley, who practically flinched when his name was spoken. "Bradley has put his blood, sweat, and tears into this development. And as your mother mentioned earlier, your parents have a substantial amount of equity tied up in his success. We need you to put a rubber stamp on that audit report. Tell Julian that Bradley is a solid investment. We need to keep this wealth inside the family." My mother reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine, but I calmly moved my hand away to pick up my wineglass. "Please, Nia," she whispered, her eyes wide with a frantic, begging intensity. "We are family. You have the power to change all of our lives tonight. Just tell Julian to sign the term sheet. Do this for us. And I promise you things will be completely different from now on. You will have the respect you have always wanted." I swirled the dark red wine in my crystal glass, watching the liquid catch the light from the chandeliers overhead. They were trying to bribe me with the basic human decency and parental love that they should have freely given me my entire life. They thought I was still that broken little girl who would trade her integrity for a seat at their table. I looked at Bradley. He was staring at his uncut steak, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. He knew exactly what was inside the audit report. He knew there was no $50 million deal. He was just silently praying that I would cover for him to save my parents from total financial ruin. "I am afraid business does not operate on family favors, Mother," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pleasant. "A $50 million capital injection requires rigorous transparency. But since we are all sitting here as one big, happy family, why don't we discuss Bradley's solid investment right now?" I set my glass down and offered Bradley a chilling, predatory smile. The psychological game had officially begun. "Tell me, Bradley," I asked, leaning slightly forward, "how is the zoning approval coming along for that massive commercial plot downtown, the one you promised my parents was going to double their retirement fund? Did the city council finally approve your permits? Or are you still operating a highly illegal shell company out of a registered mailbox in the Cayman Islands?" The color completely drained from my father's face. My mother froze her fork halfway to her mouth. Chloe whipped her head around to look at her husband, her perfectly constructed smile instantly shattering. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable explosion. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break my polite posture. I just sat at the head of the table, flanked by the most powerful man in the room, slowly and methodically tightening the noose around his neck. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded more like a dry heave. He tugged violently at the collar of his custom-tailored shirt, suddenly looking as though the expensive fabric was actively strangling him. The confident, untouchable aura he had paraded around the country club for the past hour was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered animal. Instead of answering my question about his illegal offshore accounts, he completely ignored me. He decided to play the only desperate card he had left. He believed that if he could just get the billionaire to look at his presentation, all of the fraud, the lies, and the stolen money would simply be swept under the rug in the name of corporate synergy. Always the meticulous auditor Nia. Bradley choked out, his voice trembling so violently he had to clear his throat twice. "But we are not here to talk about minor administrative details. We are here to talk about the future. We are here to talk about a fundamental paradigm shift." His hands were shaking visibly as he reached under the table and hauled his leather briefcase onto his lap. He fumbled with the brass clasps, his polished fingernails scratching against the metal in his frantic rush. He pulled out a silver iPad and practically slammed it onto the white tablecloth right next to his untouched filet mignon. He propped the screen up his fingers, swiping frantically to open a slide deck filled with glossy computer-generated images of skyscrapers that did not actually exist. "Mr. Pierce Julian, if I may." Bradley pitched his voice louder, projecting across the table in a desperate attempt to command the room. "I know this is a family celebration, but in our industry, time is money, and the market waits for absolutely no one. I want to show you exactly why my firm is the premier investment opportunity of the decade. What we are executing is a highly agile deployment of brick-and-mortar assets, leveraging hyperlocal ecosystems to maximize vertical integration." I sat back in my chair, folding my hands softly in my lap, and watched the spectacular train wreck unfold. It was a masterclass in absolute delusion. Bradley was spewing a meaningless salad of corporate buzzwords, hoping that stringing together words like agile ecosystem and integration would somehow magically equate to a $50 million valuation. But the most devastating part of the entire spectacle was not the desperate pitch itself. It was the target of the pitch. Julian didn't even blink. He didn't turn his head toward the glowing iPad screen. He didn't acknowledge Bradley's raised voice or his frantic hand gestures. Instead, Julian calmly reached over and pulled my porcelain dinner plate a few inches closer to his own. He picked up his heavy silver steak knife and his fork, his movements precise, elegant, and completely unhurried. "This cut looks a little thick for you, darling," Julian murmured, his rich baritone voice easily cutting through Bradley's frantic presentation. "The country club usually overcooks the center. Allow me." He drove the tines of his fork into the edge of my filet mignon and began slicing the meat into perfectly even pieces. The quiet, rhythmic scraping of his silver knife against the fine china was the only response Bradley received. It was the ultimate display of absolute crushing apathy. To a narcissist like Bradley, being hated or yelled at was manageable because it meant he was still significant. But being completely ignored by the very man he was begging for salvation was psychological torture. Bradley swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his throat. Heavy beads of sweat were now forming along his hairline, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. He swiped to the next slide on his iPad, leaning aggressively forward over his plate, desperately trying to force himself into Julian's field of vision. "As you can see on the projected revenue matrix," Bradley continued, his voice growing noticeably higher and faster, "we are looking at a disruptive architectural model. We are implementing crypto-backed tenant retention algorithms that will guarantee a scalable vertical trajectory. Once your $50 million tranche clears the escrow accounts, we instantly dominate the mezzanine level of the urban commercial sector. It is a completely foolproof return on investment." Julian paused his cutting for a fraction of a second. He didn't look up. He simply reached out with his left hand, picked up a small silver gravy boat, and meticulously poured a thin ribbon of peppercorn reduction over the freshly cut pieces of my steak. "Do you prefer the peppercorn or the béarnaise sauce tonight, Nia?" Julian asked casually, keeping his eyes entirely focused on the task in front of him. "The peppercorn is perfect, thank you," I replied smoothly, offering him a warm smile. Across the table, my parents were watching the scene unfold with mounting, suffocating horror. My mother was sitting perfectly rigid, her knuckles completely white as she gripped the edges of her dining chair. She was nodding frantically along with every meaningless word Bradley said, desperately trying to project enough enthusiasm for the both of them, willing the billionaire to look at the iPad. But her eyes were wide and terrified. She could see exactly what I saw. She could see the sweat pouring down her golden son-in-law's face. She could hear the desperate hollow panic vibrating in his voice. My father was faring even worse. The confident patriarch who had bullied me in the corner just 30 minutes ago was practically shrinking into his suit. He stared at the iPad screen, looking at the fake revenue matrices and the ridiculous buzzwords, and the horrifying reality of his missing $2 million retirement fund began to physically manifest on his face. He looked sick to his stomach. He looked like a man who finally realized he had handed his life savings to a slick-talking con artist. Next to him, Chloe was entirely paralyzed. She stared straight ahead, a frozen plastic smile plastered across her face, while a single tear breached her lower lash line and rolled silently down her cheek, ruining her perfect makeup. "Julian, please just look at the screen for 10 seconds. Bradley pleaded, dropping the corporate jargon entirely. The polished tech founder persona was actively disintegrating, revealing the pathetic, terrified little boy underneath. The zoning laws are shifting. The permits are practically guaranteed. If you just sign the term sheet tonight, we can bypass the regulatory friction. I just need the capital injection. I need the liquidity. Bradley pushed his chair back, the wooden legs loudly scraping against the floor. He stood up, leaning his palms heavily on the edge of the dining table. He was panting slightly, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He looked wild, unhinged, and completely broken. Julian finished slicing the final piece of steak. He set the silver knife down on the edge of the plate with a soft, definitive click. He gently pushed the plate back to the center of my placemat. Then he picked up his thick linen napkin and slowly, methodically dabbed the corners of his mouth. Only then did the billionaire finally raise his eyes. Julian didn't look at the glowing iPad. He didn't look at the glossy architectural renderings or the fake financial projections. He looked directly into Bradley's bloodshot, terrified eyes. The look on Julian's face was not anger. It was not even disgust. It was the cold, vacant expression of a man looking at a stain on the sidewalk. Bradley stood there trembling over his untouched dinner, waiting for a lifeline, waiting for a single word of encouragement, waiting for a $50 million miracle that was never going to come. The heavy, suffocating silence stretched across the table, thick enough to choke on. The entire dining room around us seemed to vanish, leaving only the devastating reality of my family's total collapse. I picked up my fork, speared a perfectly cut piece of steak, and prepared to deliver the final blow. I placed the perfectly cut piece of steak into my mouth, chewing slowly and deliberately, while the entire table watched me in agonizing suspense. I swallowed, took a polite sip of my sparkling water, and gently set my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The soft clinking sound felt deafening in the absolute silence of the dining room. Let us revisit your agile deployment of brick-and-mortar assets. Bradley, I said, keeping my voice conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than his impending federal indictment. According to the preliminary cash flow statements you submitted to my acquisition team, your primary development subsidiary currently generates zero incoming revenue. Yet you reported a sudden, unexplained capital injection of exactly $2 million on the 4th of this month. Bradley flinched, as if I had physically struck him. His eyes darted frantically toward my father, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were stark white. "That," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking horribly. "That was seed capital, early-stage liquidity from private angel investors who believe in the long-term vision of the ecosystem." Private angel investors, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. Would those private investors happen to be named Marcus and Brenda? My mother let out a sharp, strangled gasp. My father looked like he was about to be physically sick. Bradley swallowed hard, rapidly swiping a trembling hand across his sweating forehead. "The source of the seed capital is irrelevant to the corporate valuation," Bradley argued defensively, his pitch rising into a frantic whine. "Capital is capital. It shows strong local backing. It validates the market demand." "Normally, yes," I agreed smoothly. "But the problem is what happened to that capital after it entered your holding account." You see, Bradley, my forensic team, tracked a rather interesting wire transfer initiated exactly 48 hours after my parents remortgaged their home. $1.5 million was moved completely out of your corporate accounts and routed into an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands. The color completely drained from Bradley's face. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "An entity," I continued, my voice sharp and precise, "registered to a post office box under a shell company named after your childhood golden retriever." Would you care to explain to Julian and the rest of the table how a commercial real estate startup operating exclusively in downtown Atlanta requires offshore tax havens for non-existent revenue? It is a standard corporate tax optimization strategy. Bradley blurted out, his voice practically hysterical now. He was gripping the edges of his iPad so tightly his fingers were trembling. "You clearly do not understand advanced financial structuring, Nia. We are positioning the firm for international scalability. You have to shelter early liquidity from aggressive capital gains taxes. Tax optimization requires actual taxable income, Bradley. I corrected him, dropping the polite tone entirely. The temperature in my voice plummeted, carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of a senior auditor cornering a thief. You have no income. What you do have is a highly leveraged debt structure built on absolute fiction. You claim the downtown parcel of land as collateral for your existing loans, but public property records clearly show you do not hold the deed to that land. You hold a contingent lease option, and that option expired 3 months ago. You are borrowing money against assets you don't even own. He pushed his chair back violently, the wooden legs screeching against the polished floor. The sophisticated tech founder persona completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, desperate fraud. "You are twisting the numbers!" Bradley shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the elegant dining room. Several guests at neighboring tables turned their heads to stare, but Bradley was too far gone to care about the public spectacle. "You are deliberately misrepresenting the data to make me look bad." I didn't raise my voice to match his. I simply leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. "Explain your current debt-to-equity ratio. You owe over $4 million to various private lenders, excluding the money you manipulated my parents into giving you. How exactly are you making the minimum monthly payments on those high-interest loans without a single dollar of actual revenue?" Bradley was hyperventilating now, his chest heaved against his tailored shirt. He looked at Julian, who was still sitting perfectly still, watching the meltdown with cold, terrifying apathy. Bradley realized he was never going to get the $50 million. He realized he was utterly exposed. And when a narcissist is stripped of their lies, their underlying bigotry always bubbles to the surface. "You know what I am done answering to you?" Bradley spat his face, twisting into an ugly, hateful sneer. The sheer panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a venomous, condescending rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "This is exactly the problem with giving people like you a little bit of corporate power. You get a fancy title, and suddenly you think you have the right to sit at the big table and interrogate actual builders." "People like me?" I asked softly, my eyes narrowing. "Yes, people like you," Bradley yelled, leaning aggressively over the table. "You sit in your air-conditioned office, counting other people's money, acting like you are some business genius. But you don't know how the real world works. You don't know what it takes for a man to actually build an empire from scratch. You are just a bitter, angry woman who cannot stand seeing a white man succeed where you failed." My mother gasped loudly, finally horrified by the monster she had blindly welcomed into her home. Chloe shrank back in her chair, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Bradley was completely unhinged, now the racist and sexist undertones of his superiority complex fully unmasked. "You are trying to sabotage my funding because you are jealous. You are nothing but a glorified bean counter. Julian probably only gave you that partner title to fill a corporate diversity quota. Anyway, you are a diversity hire trying to ruin a legitimate businessman because you have a pathetic chip on your shoulder." The moment the words left his mouth, the atmosphere at the table shifted from tense to violently dangerous. Beside me, Julian went entirely rigid. The casual elegance he had maintained all evening vanished in a fraction of a second. His jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered near his temple, and his dark eyes turned utterly lethal. He slowly placed his hands on the table, preparing to stand up and physically annihilate the man screaming at me, but I reached out and placed my hand firmly over Julian's wrist. Julian looked at me, the terrifying protective rage radiating off him in waves. I gave him a single subtle shake of my head. He didn't need to fight this battle for me. I didn't need a billionaire to protect me from a mediocre man throwing a temper tantrum. I squeezed Julian's wrist gently, feeling his muscles slowly relax as he deferred to my authority. I turned my attention back to Bradley, who was still panting heavily, looking bizarrely proud of his hateful outburst. He actually believed he had put me in my place. He believed he had reasserted the natural hierarchy. I looked at him with absolute clinical disgust. "A diversity hire," I repeated, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his heavy breathing like a scalpel. "That is a fascinating theory, Bradley, but here is the reality. I did not get my partnership because of a quota. I got my partnership because I designed the proprietary risk assessment algorithm that caught your massive embezzlement scheme in exactly 4 seconds. I am the person who noticed that you were using new investor capital to pay off the interest on your early loans. Do you know the legal definition of that specific financial maneuver? Bradley stared at me, the hateful sneer slowly melting off his face as my words registered. It is called a Ponzi scheme, I said, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision. You are not a builder. You are not a tech founder. You are a common thief running a textbook pyramid scheme. And you are so incredibly arrogant and so staggeringly incompetent that you actually brought your fraudulent pitch deck directly to the senior forensic auditor who was already preparing your federal indictment. The word indictment hung over the dining table like a guillotine waiting to drop. For several long, agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The ambient noise of the country club around us, the soft clinking of expensive silverware, the low hum of wealthy patrons discussing their golf handicaps, the smooth jazz playing from the corner completely faded into a dull, meaningless drone. All that existed in our world was the devastating reality I had just spoken into existence. Bradley stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. The venomous, racist bravado he had wielded just moments ago evaporated entirely, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. His eyes darted wildly from my impassive face to Julian's stone-cold expression, desperately searching for a microscopic hint that this was all an elaborate, cruel prank. He wanted to believe that I was just a bitter sister-in-law lashing out. He desperately needed me to be the jealous, incompetent woman he had just screamed at. "You are bluffing," Bradley finally choked out. His voice was no longer a confident shout. It was a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze that barely made it past his throat. "Federal indictment. You are literally making things up because you are angry I called you out. You do not have the authority to trigger a federal investigation." My father suddenly found his voice. He reached across the table, his hand trembling so violently he knocked over his crystal water goblet. The ice water spilled across the white silk tablecloth, soaking into the fabric and pooling around the base of the expensive floral centerpiece, but nobody paid it any attention. "Nia, what exactly are you saying?" My father demanded, his voice cracking with pure terror. The authoritarian patriarch had completely vanished, replaced by an aging man staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. "What do you mean a pyramid scheme? What about our bridge loan? What about the $2 million? "She is lying, Marcus," my mother snapped, though her voice was shaking just as badly as his hands. She turned her panicked wide eyes to Bradley, practically begging him to validate her desperate denial. "Tell him, Bradley. Tell him she is just being a jealous, spiteful little girl. She does not know anything about your business. She just wants to ruin Chloe's big night because she is miserable. Tell us she is lying." Bradley grabbed onto my mother's desperation like a drowning man clutching a piece of floating debris. He swallowed hard, planting both of his hands firmly on the table in an attempt to stop them from shaking. He pushed his chest out, trying to summon one last surge of aggressive authority, but the sweat pouring down his face completely betrayed him. "Exactly," Bradley shouted, though his voice cracked humiliatingly on the first syllable. "She is lying. She is a low-level corporate drone trying to play God to impress her boss. Show me the proof, Nia. If I am running a Ponzi scheme, show me the paperwork. You can't just sit there and throw around words like embezzlement and indictment without hard evidence. You are bluffing to save face. You have absolutely nothing." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice to match his frantic yelling. I simply let him scream himself out. I watched the sweat drip from his chin and stain the crisp white collar of his custom-tailored shirt. I watched Chloe bury her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as silent sobs racked her body. She knew, even through her deep layers of profound denial, the golden child finally knew her perfect life was an absolute fabrication. When Bradley finally ran out of breath, leaving only the sound of his ragged, uneven panting echoing over the table, I leaned back in my chair. The psychological game had reached its absolute breaking point. He had demanded proof. He had demanded to see the paper trail that would permanently destroy his life. I raised my right hand just a few inches off the table. I looked directly into Bradley's bloodshot, terrified eyes, and I snapped my fingers lightly. It was a soft, sharp sound, but it triggered an immediate, devastating response. Beside me, Julian didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. The billionaire smoothly reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke midnight blue jacket. His movements were slow, deliberate, and chillingly precise. Every single pair of eyes at the table tracked his hand as he pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was bound tightly with thick rubber bands, its edges slightly worn from weeks of rigorous, relentless analysis by my forensic team. Julian held the folder in the air for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer weight of its existence fully register in Bradley's decaying mind. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Julian tossed the heavy file directly into the center of the dining table. It landed with a loud, authoritative thud. It hit the table right on top of the spilled ice water, narrowly missing Bradley's ridiculous silver iPad and its fake architectural renderings. Stamped across the front of the folder in bold, unapologetic red ink were the words, "Pierce Holdings, Confidential Forensic Audit." The blood completely drained from Bradley's face. He stared at the folder as if it were a live, explosive device resting next to his dinner plate. My father let out a low, agonizing groan, covering his mouth with a trembling hand. My mother stared at the red ink, her frantic denial finally shattering into a million sharp, undeniable pieces. The physical presence of that folder changed the entire atmosphere of the room. It was no longer a war of words. It was no longer a family argument over dinner. It was raw, weaponized data. It was bank statements, wire transfers, and subpoenaed records. It was the undeniable truth sitting right there under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the table. I looked at the man who had confidently told me I had a poverty mindset. I looked at the man who had promised to pull me out of my miserable life for a $50,000 fee. "I do not bluff Bradley," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal whisper that carried perfectly across the dead silence of the table. "I personally conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of your company last month, and guess what I found?" I reached out and slowly untwisted the thick rubber bands holding the file together. The sharp snap of the elastic echoed loudly in the paralyzed dining room. I flipped open the heavy manila cover, revealing hundreds of pages of pristine, meticulously highlighted financial documents, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, subpoenaed emails, and offshore account registries, all stacked in perfect, undeniable order. I slid the first thick stack of papers across the white silk tablecloth, stopping it directly in front of my father's plate. "Look at the highlighted columns, Dad," I instructed, my voice devoid of any pity or hesitation. "Follow the money. The $2 million you and Mom wired into his holding company on the 4th of this month did not go toward zoning permits. It did not go toward construction costs or architectural renderings." My father stared down at the documents. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely put his reading glasses on. He leaned over the paper, his eyes frantically scanning the numbers I had marked in bright yellow ink. "Within 24 hours of your wire transfer clearing, I continued making sure my voice carried to every person sitting at the table. $1.2 million of your retirement fund was immediately distributed to 5 different private investors. These were early-stage investors who had been actively threatening to sue Bradley for breach of contract and fraud. You did not buy equity in a skyscraper, Dad. You paid off his angry creditors to keep him out of federal prison for another 30 days. My father let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He slumped back in his chair, the paper slipping from his trembling fingers. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No. Bradley said the money was for the escrow accounts. He showed us the escrow paperwork." I reached into the folder and pulled out another sheet. I slid it over the table. "The escrow paperwork was completely forged," I stated plainly. "He downloaded a template from the internet and photoshopped the bank logos. My team verified it directly with the bank manager. The account number he gave you does not even exist." Mother let out a high-pitched, hysterical whine, gripping the edge of the table as if the room were violently spinning. "Bradley!" she cried out, her voice pleading and pathetic. "Bradley, tell her this is a mistake. Tell us you did not steal our money." Bradley just sat there, his head bowed, staring blankly at his lap. He looked like a deflated balloon. The confident, wealthy real estate developer was entirely gone. He could not even look his mother-in-law in the eye. His silence was the loudest, most devastating confession possible. But the embezzlement is only the first layer of the rot, I said, turning my attention away from my shattered parents and focusing directly on my sister. Chloe was sitting perfectly rigid, her knuckles white, as she gripped her expensive silk napkin. Her eyes were wide with a terror she could no longer hide behind her arrogant golden child facade. "Your husband loves to brag about the lifestyle he provides for you, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "He loves to show off his wealth. That brand new Range Rover you drove here tonight, the custom Porsche he bought you for your birthday last month. He told everyone they were paid in full from his massive commercial real estate profits." I pulled a thick stack of vehicle registration documents and loan agreements from the file and tossed them onto the table. "Those vehicles are not paid off," I revealed, watching the remaining color drain from her face. "In fact, they are registered as heavy commercial construction equipment under one of his fake shell companies, and the exorbitant monthly lease payments for those luxury cars are being automatically drafted directly from the remaining balance of Mom and Dad's bridge loan. Every time you drive that Porsche, you are literally burning through the money our parents saved for their old age." "No," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling violently. She turned to Bradley, her eyes filling with frantic, panicked tears. "Bradley, what is she talking about? You told me the Porsche was a cash gift. You told me business was booming." Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a pathetic whimper, but he still refused to speak. "Business is booming," I corrected her sharply. "Just not the real estate business. The fraud business requires a lot of overhead. But the cars are actually the least of your worries, Chloe, because the most expensive line item on Bradley's balance sheet is not a vehicle." I reached into the very back of the Pierce Holdings folder. This was the section marked with bright red confidential tabs. I pulled out a glossy 20-page residential lease agreement and a massive stack of American Express credit card statements. "It is a luxury penthouse apartment in the most expensive high-rise in Buckhead," I announced, dropping the lease agreement squarely in front of Chloe. Chloe stared down at the document, her breathing becoming ragged and shallow. She shook her head in confused denial. "We do not own an apartment in Buckhead," she stammered. "We live in the suburbs. Bradley said we were waiting to buy a mansion until the funding round closed." "You do not live in Buckhead," I agreed smoothly. "But Bradley pays $8,500 a month for a penthouse there. And according to these credit card statements, he also pays for weekly shopping sprees at high-end designer boutiques. Just last Tuesday, he charged $50,000 at a luxury jeweler downtown for a custom diamond tennis bracelet." I paused, letting my eyes drop pointedly to Chloe's bare wrists. "I noticed you are not wearing a new diamond tennis bracelet tonight, sister." Chloe gasped a sharp physical intake of air as the devastating reality finally pierced through her walls of delusion. Her hands flew to her mouth, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her cheeks. I slid the final photograph across the table. It was a clear, high-resolution image taken by the private investigator my firm had hired during the background check. It showed Bradley walking out of a high-end restaurant, his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of a beautiful, much younger woman wearing a diamond tennis bracelet. "The Buckhead penthouse is leased under the name Sarah Jenkins," I stated, my voice echoing with brutal, uncompromising clarity. "She is a 24-year-old blonde Pilates instructor, and according to Bradley's corporate tax filings, she has been on his payroll as a senior executive consultant for the past 18 months, pulling a salary of $120,000 a year." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profoundly destructive. "He has not just been stealing from our parents to fund his fake business," I concluded, looking directly into Chloe's horrified eyes. "He has been using our parents' retirement fund to finance his white mistress." For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The entire table stared at the photograph of Bradley kissing the blonde woman. Then the explosion happened. Chloe let out a sound that I had never heard her make before. It was not her usual theatrical, performative crying. It was a guttural, primal scream of absolute agony and humiliation. The golden child, the sister who had spent her entire life mocking my career and flaunting her perfect marriage, completely shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of me. She lunged forward, her hands curling into claws. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet and hurled it directly at Bradley's chest. The glass shattered against his shoulder, sending ice and water flying across his face and his expensive suit. "You bastard!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. "You absolute monster! You lied to me! You took my parents' money and gave it to some cheap blonde tramp." Bradley scrambled backward, his chair tipping dangerously as he tried to protect his face from his hysterical wife. "Chloe, please," he begged, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to block her. "Chloe, let me explain. It meant nothing. It was just a stupid mistake." "A mistake!" she shrieked, climbing out of her chair and throwing her heavy linen napkin directly into his face. "You bought her a $50,000 bracelet with my father's money while telling me we could not afford to go to Paris this summer. I hate you. I wish you were dead." My mother jumped up from her chair, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She rushed around the table, grabbing Chloe by the shoulders, trying to pull her away before she completely destroyed the dining room. But Chloe fought her off, thrashing wildly, her perfect emerald silk dress twisting around her legs. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined, dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks as she sobbed uncontrollably. My father remained frozen in his seat. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the ruined dinner, the screaming women, and the crying, pathetic man he had trusted with his life savings. The patriarch of the family looked incredibly small, aged by 10 years in a matter of minutes. He put his head in his hands and began to weep silently. I sat back in my chair, watching the chaotic, hysterical wreckage of my family. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel pity. I felt the cold, satisfying weight of justice finally balancing the scales. Beside me, Julian calmly picked up his glass of sparkling water, took a slow sip, and watched the destruction with the detached interest of a man watching a predictable storm finally roll in. The hysterical sounds of my sister weeping and the pathetic apologies tumbling from Bradley's mouth became nothing more than white noise. I turned my attention away from their shattered marriage and focused entirely on the other side of the table. My parents were sitting exactly where they had been since the folder landed, but they looked entirely hollowed out. The arrogant, status-obsessed couple who had spent my entire life belittling my achievements had been completely broken by a single stack of paper. But the audit was not over. I reached back into the thick manila folder. There was one final section I had not yet presented. "We are not quite finished," I announced, my voice easily slicing through the chaotic sounds of the dining room. "Mom, Dad, I need you to look at me." My father slowly raised his head. His eyes were red and watery, his face completely devoid of the authoritarian pride he had worn like armor for decades. My mother looked up a second later, her hands still trembling violently in her lap. They looked at me with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. For the first time in my entire 32 years of life, they were not looking at me as their disappointing scapegoat. They were looking at me as their only remaining lifeline. I slid a thick, heavily stapled packet of bank statements across the white silk tablecloth. I pushed it directly into the center of my father's placemat, right next to his spilled water glass. "You thought you were investing in a massive commercial real estate empire," I said, keeping my tone strictly analytical. "You thought you were securing generational wealth and elevating our family to the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society. You gave him $2 million of your hard-earned equity because he promised to double it. I need you to look at page 3 of that statement and see exactly how your golden son-in-law attempted to double your money." My father reached out with shaking hands and turned to the 3rd page. His eyes scanned the highlighted columns, but his expression remained blank. He was a man who understood traditional banking and steady suburban savings accounts. The terminology on the paper in front of him clearly made absolutely no sense to his traditional mind. "What is this?" my father rasped, squinting at the black ink. "What is Binance? What does FTX mean? Are these international real estate holding companies?" "They are cryptocurrency exchanges," I answered smoothly. "Bradley did not use your retirement fund to secure land permits or hire construction crews. When the massive debts from his Ponzi scheme started catching up to him, he panicked. He took your $2 million bridge loan and he attempted to gamble his way out of federal prison." My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. "Gamble!" She repeated the word, sounding completely foreign on her tongue. I nodded, tapping a sharp fingernail against the edge of the table. He wired hundreds of thousands of dollars into unregulated offshore crypto exchanges. He was desperately day trading highly volatile digital assets, chasing a miraculous return to cover the millions he had already stolen. When the crypto market crashed and he lost over $600,000 of your money in a single afternoon, he completely lost his mind. He resorted to physical gambling. I pointed to the bottom half of the page my father was holding. "Look at the transaction history from last weekend, Dad. While you and Mom were bragging to your friends at the country club about your brilliant real estate developer's son-in-law Bradley was occupying a high-roller suite in Las Vegas." My father's eyes dropped to the highlighted rows. His jaw went completely slack. "He withdrew $400,000 in cash advances directly on the floor of the Bellagio casino," I stated, my voice echoing with brutal clarity. "He spent 36 straight hours at the high-stakes baccarat tables. He was blindly throwing $100,000 chips onto the felt, desperately praying for a winning streak that never came. He lost every single cent. He drank expensive champagne. He tipped the dealers with your retirement money, and he walked out of that casino with absolutely nothing." "No!" My father groaned, a sound of such profound, agonizing despair that it actually made a few guests at the neighboring tables pause their conversations. He dropped the bank statement onto his plate as if it had physically burned his fingers. $2 million. It is all gone. Everything I worked my entire life to build it is just gone." My mother began to shake her head rapidly, her meticulously styled hair coming undone. "This cannot be happening," she whimpered, her voice rising in pitch until it was nearly a scream. "Bradley, you promised us. You sat in our living room and swore on your life that the money was safe. You told us it was sitting in an untouchable escrow account." Bradley did not answer her. He was still cowering away from Chloe, completely covered in ice water and shame. He had absolutely no lies left to tell. The staggering magnitude of his incompetence was fully exposed. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was just a pathetic, desperate man who had played God with my parents' lives and lost entirely. But I am afraid the gambling losses are only the secondary consequence of your blind loyalty. I continued, refusing to let them look away from the wreckage they had actively helped create. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy legal paper. It was not a bank statement. It was an official court document stamped and notarized in thick black ink. I placed it gently on the table and pushed it toward my mother. "You remortgaged the house to give him that money," I said softly. "The house you have lived in for 30 years. The house you always told me I was not good enough to inherit." My mother stared at the legal document, her eyes wide with a fresh, paralyzing terror. "What is this, Nia? What does this mean? Did you actually read the fine print of the loan documents Bradley brokered for you?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "Because he did not just take a standard home equity line of credit. He structured a predatory high-interest balloon mortgage to get the absolute maximum amount of cash up front. He forged the secondary income verification documents using his own fake shell companies as guarantors." "Masa!" My father squeezed his eyes shut, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and running down his wrinkled cheeks. "The monthly payments," he whispered. "The payments were astronomical. Bradley said he was setting up an automatic draft to cover them. He promised we would never have to pay a single dime out of pocket." "And he lied," I confirmed effortlessly. "He never made a single payment. The loan went into default 45 days ago. The bank immediately triggered the acceleration clause." I pointed to the bold black letters at the top of the page. "That is a formal notice of default. Mom, your massive, beautiful house in the affluent suburbs, the manicured lawn, the heated swimming pool, the perfect brick facade you used to judge everyone else around you, it is entirely gone. Your property is on the bank's active foreclosure list." The silence that hit the table was absolute. It was heavier than the shock of the mistress. It was heavier than the crypto losses. To my parents, Image was their entire world. Their home was their fortress of superiority. It was the physical proof that they were better than their neighbors, better than their extended family, and certainly better than me. The sheriff will be arriving to post the eviction notice on your front door by next Tuesday. I concluded, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Your neighbors will watch you carry your belongings out in cardboard boxes. Your friends at the country club will see the bank auction signs on your front lawn. You have absolutely nothing left. My mother stared at the foreclosure notice. Her breathing became incredibly rapid, shallow little gasps of air that barely filled her lungs. She looked at the destroyed dining table. She looked at Chloe, who was rocking back and forth in her chair, weeping uncontrollably. She looked at Bradley, the white savior she had worshipped, now reduced to a shivering, pathetic fraud. Then she looked at me. She saw the absolute, uncompromising coldness in my eyes. She saw that I was not going to save her. I was not going to write a check to stop the bank. I was not going to beg Julian to bail them out. I was simply watching the consequences of their own toxic behavior finally crush them. My mother decided to play her final desperate card. She reverted to the exact same manipulative tactic she had used my entire childhood whenever she was losing an argument. She placed the back of her hand against her forehead, let out a loud theatrical gasp, and allowed her eyes to roll back into her head. With a dramatic, perfectly calculated sigh, Brenda went completely limp. She slid sideways off her dining chair, clearly expecting someone to lunge forward and break her fall. She expected my father to catch her. She expected me to scream for a doctor. She expected Julian to rush to her aid. Nobody moved. My father was too paralyzed by his own despair to even notice she was falling. Chloe was entirely consumed by her own catastrophic heartbreak. Bradley was frozen in fear, and Julian and I simply watched. My mother hit the thick dining room carpet with a heavy, ungraceful thud. The impact was louder than she had probably anticipated. She lay there on the floor, her expensive pearl necklace tangled around her neck, her designer dress bunched up around her knees. For a long, humiliating moment, she kept her eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the frantic rush of concern that she felt she was owed. But the concern never came. The silence stretched out thick and unforgiving. I sat at the head of the table, cutting another piece of my steak, perfectly content to let her lay in the mess she had created. The sight of my mother lying completely motionless on the dining room floor should have been the moment the entire party stopped. It should have been the moment someone called for an ambulance, or at the very least, rushed to her side to offer comfort. But the devastating reality of the financial ruin I had just exposed was far too massive to be overshadowed by one of her classic theatrical performances. She opened one eye a fraction of an inch, realized absolutely no one was rushing to save her, and let out a pathetic, trembling sob into the expensive carpet. Bradley was no longer looking at my mother. He was no longer looking at Chloe, who was still weeping into her hands, completely shattered by the revelation of his mistress. Bradley was staring directly at me. His chest heaved violently under his soaked, water-stained shirt. The mask of the sophisticated, untouchable white savior had completely melted away, leaving behind a rabid, cornered animal. His brain, fueled by staggering narcissism and pure desperation, finally short-circuited. He could not accept that he had been outsmarted. He could not process the fact that a black woman he viewed with such profound racist disdain had systematically dismantled his entire life over the course of a single dinner. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The veins in his neck bulged, pulsing rapidly against his skin. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure rage. Bradley planted his hands on the edge of the table and violently shoved himself forward. He lunged directly across the white silk tablecloth, knocking over crystal wine glasses and sending plates of expensive food crashing to the floor. He didn't care about the audience. He didn't care about the country club staff watching in horror. He wanted to physically destroy the person who had exposed him. "You ruined everything!" Bradley screamed, his voice tearing through the dining room like a siren. His hands clawed frantically at the air, trying to reach across the wide table to grab my throat. "I will go bankrupt, and your parents will be homeless on the streets." He never even made it past the floral centerpiece. Before Bradley could stretch his arms another inch toward me, Julian moved. It happened with terrifying, blinding speed. The billionaire did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He simply stood up, reached across the table with one massive hand, and grabbed Bradley directly by the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. Julian twisted the expensive fabric, cutting off Bradley's air supply instantly and violently shoved him backward. Bradley flew back his polished shoes, slipping wildly on the marble floor. He crashed hard into his own wooden dining chair, the force of the impact sending both him and the chair toppling backward. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, gasping for air, his arms flailing as he tried to untangle himself from the ruined furniture. Julian stood perfectly straight, smoothing his midnight blue suit jacket with absolute terrifying calm. He looked down at Bradley, writhing on the floor, his dark eyes radiating a lethal warning. "If you ever try to move toward her again," Julian said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that sent chills through the entire room, "I will ensure that bankruptcy is the absolute least of your problems." The dining room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sounds were Bradley's ragged coughing from the floor and Chloe's muffled sobbing. My father was practically paralyzed in his seat, his eyes wide with horror as he stared at the physical wreckage of his golden son-in-law. I didn't flinch during the attack. I didn't step back. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and tossed it onto my porcelain plate. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up. I looked down at Bradley. He was scrambling to his knees, clutching his bruised throat, his face red and slick with sweat. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pathetic mixture of rage and terror. He actually believed his own words. He believed he was the victim. He believed I had destroyed my own parents' lives by exposing his crimes. "You are wrong, Bradley," I said. My voice was completely steady, ringing out with the absolute, uncompromising authority of a judge handing down a final sentence. "You are entirely wrong about the fate of my parents." Bradley coughed, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. "You just showed them the foreclosure notice," he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at the table. "You told them the sheriff is coming to evict them. You did this to them. You took away their house just to prove a point to me." I slowly walked around the edge of the dining table, my leather heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I stopped right in front of where my father was sitting. Marcus was staring up at me, his face pale and hollow, waiting for the final blow that would completely end his life as he knew it. My mother finally sat up from the floor, her fake fainting spell entirely forgotten as she listened to my words. "I did show them a notice of default," I clarified, keeping my eyes locked on Bradley. "But I never said the bank was going to foreclose on this family. I said the house was on the active foreclosure list. There is a massive legal distinction between those two realities." I reached back onto the table, picked up the official legal document, and held it in the air. "When my forensic team uncovered your massive embezzlement operation 3 weeks ago," I explained, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision, "I did not just find the offshore accounts and the fake construction permits. I found the original loan documents you forced my parents to sign. And because I am a senior auditor who actually reads the fine print, I noticed something incredibly interesting on the final page of the mortgage agreement." Bradley froze. His breathing stopped entirely. The confused, angry look on his face was suddenly replaced by a look of profound, absolute panic. "The secondary guarantor signature on that $2 million loan did not belong to my father," I stated, turning to look directly at Marcus. "You forged my father's signature on the final liability waiver, Bradley. You digitally copied his handwriting from an old tax return to bypass the bank's secondary verification process. You committed felony wire fraud and identity theft to secure that money." My father let out a sharp, ragged gasp. "He forged it," my father whispered, his hands flying to his face. "He stole my identity." I turned my attention back to Bradley, who was now visibly trembling on his knees. The moment I found the forged signature, I contacted the commercial lending division at the bank. I continued, my voice cold and relentless. I informed their executive board that their $2 million bridge loan was secured by fraudulent documents. The bank realized they were holding a massive toxic liability. They knew that if this went to federal court, the loan would be completely invalidated, and they would lose every single cent you stole. They were desperate to offload the bad debt before the federal indictment hit the public record. My mother slowly pulled herself up to her knees, clutching the edge of the table. "Nia, what did you do?" she asked, her voice small and terrified. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a woman who had finally conquered the demons of her childhood. "I bought the debt," I announced softly. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed to comprehend the magnitude of what I had just said. I used my own personal capital to purchase the non-performing loan directly from the bank at a deeply discounted premium. I explained, breaking the reality down into simple, devastating terms. The bank legally reassigned the mortgage, the deed of trust, and the total liability of the $2 million entirely over to me. Bradley let out a pathetic whimper, shaking his head in rapid, frantic denial. "No," he breathed out. "No, you cannot do that. That is illegal." "It is perfectly legal, Bradley," I corrected him smoothly. "It is a standard corporate acquisition of distressed assets. You wanted to play in the big leagues of real estate. You wanted to throw around words like leverage and liquidity. Well, let me show you what real leverage actually looks like." I stepped closer to him, looking down at his pathetic, ruined form. "This house has not been foreclosed on," I declared, my voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. "Because I own the debt. I am the sole proprietor of the mortgage. I am your creditor. I hold the legal rights to the $2 million you stole, and I hold the deed to the property you used as collateral." I turned slightly, casting a sweeping glance over my mother, my father, and my weeping sister. I looked at the lavish dining room, the crystal chandeliers, and the expensive food scattered across the floor. "I am the new owner of this house," I stated my words, striking the room like physical blows. "You are sitting at my dining table. You are eating the food I allowed you to eat. You are standing under a roof that I completely own." My father buried his face in his hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The ultimate patriarch, the man who had spent his entire life building a fortress of superiority and looking down on my career, had just realized the horrifying truth. He was no longer the master of his own home. He was a tenant, living entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had treated like absolute garbage. My mother stayed on her knees, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. The psychological hierarchy she had so carefully constructed over 32 years was completely obliterated. The golden child was married to a broke, cheating felon. The white savior was going to federal prison, and the scapegoat, the daughter she had mocked for wearing a cheap suit, was now the undisputed ruler of their entire universe. Bradley stayed on the floor, his head bowed, tears of pure defeat finally streaming down his face. He had nothing left to say. He had no more buzzwords. He had no more lies. He was totally, completely destroyed. I stood at the head of my table, surrounded by the wreckage of their arrogance, and I finally felt the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood completely lift off my shoulders. The silence in the dining room was suddenly broken by a harsh, sweeping flash of color. It started as a faint reflection on the large glass windows overlooking the manicured golf course, but within seconds, it intensified into a blinding, rhythmic pulse. Brilliant strobes of red and blue light cut aggressively through the warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers. The sharp colors danced across the ruined white silk tablecloth, illuminated the shattered crystal on the floor, and cast long, erratic shadows against the elegant walls of the country club. A moment later, the distinct, terrifying wail of multiple police sirens pierced the quiet suburban night. The sirens grew deafeningly loud before abruptly cutting off right in the front circular driveway of the club. My father slowly turned his head toward the windows, his red, tear-filled eyes squinting against the flashing lights. He looked confused, his brain too overloaded by the consecutive traumas of the evening to fully process what was happening outside. My mother clutched the edge of the table, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked frantically from the windows to the heavy mahogany doors of the dining room, the ingrained terror of public scandal finally overriding her financial shock. But Bradley knew. The moment the red and blue lights hit his face, the last remaining shred of his sanity completely evaporated. He did not look confused. He looked like a man staring directly into his own open grave. He scrambled backward across the marble floor, his expensive suit dragging through the spilled water and food, desperately trying to put distance between himself and the grand entrance. "You called them!" Bradley gasped, his voice a ragged, breathless wheeze. He looked up at me, his eyes practically bulging out of his skull. "You called the police." "I did not call the local police, Bradley," I corrected him, my voice carrying a terrifying clinical calmness that easily cut through the rising panic in the room. When you operate at the executive level of corporate risk management, you do not just casually uncover a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme and keep it to yourself. As a senior partner and a certified forensic auditor, I am a mandatory reporter for financial crimes. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. The flashing lights outside cast my shadow directly over his trembling body. I submitted the full, unredacted contents of that manila folder to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the White-Collar Crime Division of the FBI at 8 o'clock this morning, I stated. They have spent the entire day verifying the offshore wire transfers and securing federal warrants for your arrest, the seizure of your fake shell companies, and the freezing of every single bank account associated with your name. The word FBI hit the room like a physical shockwave. Bradley let out a sound that I could only describe as the dying cry of a coward. It was a high-pitched, agonizing wail. He scrambled to his knees, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass digging into his expensive trousers. He crawled directly toward me, his hands clasped together in front of his chest, in a posture of desperate, humiliating prayer. "Please, Naya, please!" Bradley sobbed, the tears streaming freely down his flushed face, mixing with the sweat and the ice water. He threw his pride entirely away, begging for his life in front of the entire country club. "I will do anything. I will sign the company over to you. I will pay back every single cent I took from your parents. I will leave Chloe. I will walk away with nothing. Just call them off. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them the audit was flawed. You are a partner at Pierce Holdings. They will listen to you." He reached out to grab the hem of my skirt, but Julian smoothly stepped between us, using the toe of his polished leather shoe to firmly push Bradley's reaching hands away. "Do not touch her," Julian warned, his voice, a low, lethal rumble that instantly made Bradley recoil. Before Bradley could launch into another pathetic plea, I felt two pairs of hands violently grab my arms from behind. I turned my head and saw my mother and father standing right next to me. Their faces were contorted in absolute panic. The reality of a federal arrest happening in the middle of their Ruby anniversary dinner had completely shattered their obsession with high society appearances. "Nia, you have to stop this right now," my mother hissed, her manicured nails digging painfully into my forearm. Her eyes darted wildly around the dining room, watching the other wealthy patrons pointing and whispering as the police lights continued to strobe through the windows. "You are causing a massive scene. Everyone is looking at us. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? You are ruining our reputation permanently." My father grabbed my other arm, his grip desperate and shaking. "Tell them to go away, Nia," he pleaded, his voice cracking with panicked urgency. "We can handle this internally as a family. We can liquidate whatever assets are left. We will figure out the money. But you cannot let the FBI drag my son-in-law out of the country club in handcuffs. The scandal will completely destroy us. We will never be able to show our faces in this city again." Even Chloe, who had just spent the past 10 minutes screaming that she wished her husband was dead, stumbled forward. She grabbed the lapel of my charcoal suit, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "Nia, please," she sobbed completely, reverting to the helpless golden child demanding to be rescued. "He is a liar and a cheat, but he is my husband. He is family. You cannot send him to federal prison. What will my friends say? What will happen to my life?" I looked at the three of them holding on to me. They had just lost their entire retirement fund. They had just found out their house was going into foreclosure. They had just learned that Bradley was spending their stolen money on a 24-year-old mistress. And yet, their greatest concern, the thing that finally drove them to beg me for help, was the fear of what their wealthy friends would think. They were more terrified of losing their fake social status than they were of the man who had completely destroyed their future. I slowly and deliberately pulled my arms out of their frantic grips. I smoothed the lapels of my suit, stepping back to break the physical connection with them entirely. "You do not have a reputation left to protect," I told my parents, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. "You built your entire lives on the illusion of superiority, and you sacrificed me to maintain it. You chose a white savior over your own daughter. You chose the illusion of wealth over the truth. I am not stopping anything. This is the exact reality you fought so hard to protect. Now you get to live in it. As soon as the words left my mouth, the heavy double doors of the dining room were violently shoved open. The soft jazz music playing in the background was entirely drowned out by the heavy, synchronized stomping of tactical boots on the polished marble floor. A dozen federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI stormed into the elegant banquet hall. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, completely ignoring the shocked gasps and screams of the wealthy country club patrons who frantically scrambled out of their way. The country club manager tried to jog alongside the lead agent, waving his hands nervously, but the agent simply flashed a gold badge and kept walking straight toward our table. "Bradley Jenkins," the lead agent barked, his authoritative voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Bradley did not try to run. He did not try to fight. He simply collapsed completely onto the floor, curling into a pathetic ball, sobbing so violently his entire body shook. He buried his face in his hands, perfectly aware that his life of luxury and unearned arrogance was permanently over. Two agents immediately converged on him. They did not show an ounce of hesitation or pity for his expensive suit. They grabbed Bradley by his arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. He was completely limp, forcing the agents to physically support his dead weight. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly over the dead silence of the dining room. "You are under federal arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and securities fraud," the lead agent recited quickly, his eyes scanning the shattered table before locking briefly onto me. He gave me a single professional nod of acknowledgement, confirming that my forensic audit had been exactly as flawless as promised. "No!" Bradley wailed, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched squeal as the agents turned him around. "Please, Marcus, Brenda, do something! Help me!" My parents did not move. They stood frozen, watching the ultimate prize of their family tree being paraded through the center of the country club like a common criminal. The entire room of elite guests stood in absolute silence, watching the disgraced real estate developer being dragged out toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting in the driveway. The destruction was absolute, and the price had finally been paid. The heavy mahogany doors of the dining room swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the chaotic sound of Bradley sobbing in the hallway. The flashing red and blue lights outside slowly pulled away, leaving the banquet hall bathed once again in the warm, quiet glow of the crystal chandeliers. But the atmosphere inside the room was permanently altered. The wealthy country club patrons were staring at our table in stunned silence, their expensive dinners completely forgotten. My parents and my sister slowly turned to face me. The arrogant, untouchable facade they had maintained for decades was entirely gone. They looked like strangers, hollowed out and trembling. The massive financial safety net they had relied on, the unearned superiority they had weaponized against me my entire life, had all been violently stripped away in less than an hour. My father cleared his throat, his hands shaking as he gripped the back of his chair for physical support. "Nia," he started, his voice barely a whisper. He could not look me in the eye. He stared at the shattered crystal and the spilled water on the floor. "What happens now? We have absolutely nothing. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at the man who had allowed my mother to belittle me, the man who had handed his life savings to a con artist simply because the con artist was white and charismatic. I felt absolutely no sympathy. "You are not going to be homeless," I said, my voice calm and perfectly level. "I am going to allow you and Mom to remain in the house." My mother let out a loud, ragged sigh of relief, bringing her hands to her face. "Oh, thank God," she wept. "Thank you, Nia. I knew you would not let your own parents end up on the street. I knew you still loved us. Do not misunderstand me." I interrupted, my tone instantly freezing her tears. "You are not staying there as the owners. You are staying there as my tenants. Tomorrow morning my lawyers will send over a standard residential lease agreement. You will pay me market rent on the first of every single month. You will cover the property taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance. If you miss a payment, or if you attempt to leverage my property for another one of your ridiculous social climbs, I will execute a legal eviction without a second thought. You have absolutely zero equity in that home. You live there entirely at my discretion." My parents stared at me, the brutal reality of their new existence washing over them. They were no longer the lords of their suburban manor. They were renters. They would have to look at the walls of that massive house every single day and know that it belonged to the daughter they had treated like a failure. It was a psychological prison of their own making, and I was handing them the keys. Chloe stepped forward, her ruined emerald silk dress rustling softly. She wiped her mascara-stained cheeks, looking at me with the desperate, entitled expectation she had used to navigate her entire life. "Nia, what about me?" Chloe asked, her lower lip trembling. "Bradley is going to prison. The FBI is going to seize our bank accounts. I have nowhere to go. I cannot afford my lifestyle anymore. You have to let me move into the Buckhead apartment, or maybe you can set up a trust fund for me until I figure things out. I am your sister. You have to help me." I looked at the golden child. I looked at the woman who had laughed at me when I walked into the party alone, the woman who had spent her 20s mocking my long hours and my corporate wardrobe. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. Chloe blinked, genuinely shocked. "What do you mean you just saved Mom and Dad? You have millions of dollars. You are a senior partner. You can easily afford to take care of me." "I can afford it," I agreed smoothly. "But I will not spend a single cent of my hard-earned money subsidizing your delusions. You spent your entire life believing that your looks and your manipulative charm entitled you to a free ride. You laughed at my ambition. You called me a walking spreadsheet. Well, it is time for you to learn how the real world works." I picked up my leather briefcase, snapping the brass clasp shut with a sharp, definitive click. "You need to get a job, Chloe," I told her, holding her horrified gaze. "You need to update your resume, buy a cheap suit, and figure out how to survive on your own. I am completely cutting you off. Do not call my phone asking for loans. Do not show up at my office crying. I am no longer playing a supporting role in your tragic little drama." Chloe opened her mouth to scream, her face contorting with fresh rage. But I simply turned my back on her. I had given them exactly what they deserved. I had balanced the ledger. There was nothing left for me in that room. Julian stepped forward, his tall, imposing frame easily shielding me from my family. He looked down at me, the cold, terrifying billionaire persona melting away, replaced by the warm, deeply supportive man I loved. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew I was. He simply extended his hand. I slipped my hand into his, feeling the strong, grounding warmth of his fingers, interlocking with mine. We turned and walked together toward the grand double doors of the dining room. The sea of wealthy relatives and country club elites parted for us immediately, their eyes cast downward in absolute submission and fear. Nobody said a word. Nobody tried to stop us. We walked out of the banquet hall, out of the lavish foyer, and pushed through the heavy front doors into the cool, crisp night air. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of pine and freedom. The chaotic screaming of my sister, echoing faintly from inside the building, faded away, entirely irrelevant to my future. I squeezed Julian's hand, stepping out of the shadows of my past and walking toward the brilliant life I had built with my own two hands. The heavy mahogany doors of the country club fade into the background, replaced by the soft, ambient glow of my modern living room. I'm sitting back in my velvet armchair, the city skyline twinkling quietly through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. It has been exactly 1 year since that anniversary dinner. Bradley is currently serving an 85-month sentence in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. My parents are still living in my house, paying their rent on time every single month, terrified of stepping out of line. Their social circle completely abandoned them after the scandal broke, leaving them with nothing but the quiet reality of their choices. And Chloe recently took a job as a shift manager at a retail clothing store, finally learning the value of $1 the hard way. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is everything. We are told that blood is thicker than water and that we must endlessly forgive the people who share our genetics, no matter how terribly they treat us. But that is a lie designed to keep victims trapped in toxic cycles. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who will eagerly drown you to save themselves. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your financial stability to anyone who actively roots for your downfall. Setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Your worth is not determined by the people who are too blind to see it. If you are watching this, and you are the black sheep of your family, if you are the one carrying the heavy burden of being independent while everyone else acts entitled to your light, I want you to know that you have the power to walk away. You can rewrite the hierarchy. You can be your own savior. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to set a firm boundary with a toxic family member to protect your own peace. How did you find the strength to walk away? Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their peace is non-negotiable. Thank you for listening to my story. Keep your standards high, keep your boundaries ironclad, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for winning.